Everyone, I want to bring you this video for this chapter because a lot of the videos that are on YouTube don't quite fit to what AMSCO covers in chapter 17. So the last West is sort of a big part of the chapter, but the New South, I wanted to make sure that we covered some major important pieces there. So for the chapter outline, some kind of like the where we're going with these topics. We're mainly talking about Western settlement. So this is the idea that people are moving west, and we have the mining frontier, the cattle frontier, and the farming frontier. And as these people move out for various reasons, we're going to have what's called the closing of the frontier, which will have some historical significance for us. For the major impact here we're going to see is over and over again is going to be the impact on Native Americans. Also, we see this rise of something called the conservation movement. And then there's this piece that the chapter discusses the New South. I feel like the New South, that topic can be covered in a few different chapters, and they chose it to chunk it in with this chapter. Nevertheless, it does link us to some of the farm problems that are faced throughout the country, regardless of region. But the New South is something I did not want to omit. So when we think of essential questions, these are big ideas, big questions we can ask. I'm going to revisit these questions at the end and sort of fill in some evidence for you guys. To what extent did the natural environment shape the development of the West beyond the Mississippi and the lives of those who lived and settled there? How important were other factors? Analyze the ways in which technology, government policy, and economic conditions changed the American frontier in the period of 1865 to 1900. So we're thinking about the frontier, we're thinking about the environment, to what extent did the natural environment play a role? And then we also have these other factors, government policy, economic conditions. We'll break those down as we go along in this video. So the big story here is that there is a dramatic post-war expansion. We see that people are moving in west to these states, and there's going to be new states added. There's 10 new states added within this period, 1865 to 1900. And if you look at this chart, it's mainly centered around, you see these GS things. This is gold and silver mines. So the minerals that are available there and the metals and minerals that are available there drive people west within these regions. So of course that this land is not unoccupied. We're going to see the impacts of Native Americans. It's going to lead to a loss of land, changes to ways of life, and one of the biggest factors here is the animal called the buffalo, to which Native American tribes were heavily dependent upon. They're going to see a loss in the buffalo population, which is going to then in turn lead to a loss of culture and life for Native Americans. So as for the mining frontier, we see the places that you need to know is Pikes Peak, where they discovered gold, Comstock Lode, where they discovered silver, in the Homestead Mine in Dakotas. All of these lead up to what are called boom towns, where there are people rushing in order to, they set up some kind of quick little town. If you think of like the Old West, and how they have like those wooden like shack buildings, built up very quickly. Those were like the boom towns. And ultimately what happens is that when the mine runs out, the local economy fails, right? And we call them the ghost towns. Virginia City, Nevada was one of these famous boom towns, and it featured dance hall girls, theaters. It had a bustling economy for the time that it was there. Other ones like San Francisco, Sacramento, and Denver still remain populated, and they're still urban centers today. So why is it also that we lose these mining towns? Is that the whole idea of panning for gold, an individual going out there with hand equipment to try and find gold or silver, when big business comes in and with machinery, and they're able to extract more and be more efficient, but with a high cost, they are going to have an advantage here. So that turns into large scale industry. So one of the major impacts here is we see another rise of nativism. So as we see an increase in immigration, we should always think about the nativist impact that results. We have a political cartoon underneath here. I don't want to move. Yeah, so this is just one of the prejudiced and negative characterizations of the Chinese, because one third of the in the 1860s, one third of Western miners were from China. So we're seeing this massive influx of Chinese. They're calling them, the cheap labor. We see immorality, opium, smallpox. Right? They're blaming them, putting all of this onto the Chinese culture. This cartoon, however, portrays them in a more positive light, saying that we are going to lock them out of the United States immigration, yet we bring with them industry, order, peace, sobriety, and yet we're going to let in all these other people, the communist, nihilist, socialist. All of these people are the ones that are coming from Eastern Europe. We're letting those in, but then we're going to shut these guys out. So. Uh, the Chinese, this is referencing the Chinese Exclusion Act, and this was the first major policy, immigration policy in the United States. So this has some other implications too, is that there's this debate over gold or silver-backed currency. This will become more relevant when we talk about it during the populist movement, but just know that the rise in the collection of these metals will then fuel a debate over what the uh, what what our currency should be backed up on. So within the cattle frontier, some important things you need to know is that there was these Texas cowboys and Mexican cowboys, and what they did was they rounded up cattle and they would move them up and down the grasslands from Texas to Canada. And and this was pretty, like, it says antebellum. So before the war, there was about $3 to $5 per cattle. But then once they got hooked up to the railroad, there was a much greater demand for these cattle and for beef in general. So uh, they would transport the cattle and feed the cattle on the grass, going up and down, and then sell the cattle at these stations. These are really important, like Abilene. They sell Chicago and St. Louis, and so this began to change dramatically because there was a couple of developments. Right, we have the invention of barbed wire, which if you know what barbed wire is, it's just another way to fence in when you don't have wood. We'll see this with the homesteaders as well. But the homesteaders had their land fenced in, so it made it difficult to transport cattle across these plains on this essentially private property. In the winter of 85 to 86, we also see dramatic losses to cattle, and we see a drought, which makes it harder to feed the cattle in the grassland. So within the farming frontier, this is where we see it from the Homestead Act back during the Civil War. They would give 160 acres to 160 acres to families, but they had to live on the land for 5 years. 500,000 families settled on those homesteads, but five times that number moved, but they paid land to the railroad companies and speculators. What a speculator was that somebody who purchased the land, somebody who obtained the land from the government or got it and then resold it at a profit. So moving out on the frontier, although this was idealized as like a way for your family to become independent and start a farm, there was lots of problems in the Great Plains. Severe weather, lack of water, cold weather, high rate of pestilence, which is like there was like grasshopper plagues and disease. Nevertheless, there were people who persevered through this, again, utilizing barbed wire to help fence in their territory. They use windmills as a form of irrigation, and they're called dry farming techniques. So one of the major problems here is that we have these independent farmers who are moving out, and they're going to be producing crops. And so when there's this massive increase in crops, massive quantity and increase of crops, it drops the price. So there was these falling crop prices, which makes it incredibly difficult to have a farm, especially in the face of industrial farming, which we'll talk about. So as we have these different frontiers, this historian named Frederick Jackson Turner, pictured here, he is going to have this what's called the frontier thesis. His viewpoint is that settling on the frontier was a social leveler, which essentially what he means is that no matter your conditions on the East Coast, and that's where typically people are coming from, on the East Coast, is that if you were not happy about the conditions, you could always move west. And so, whatever disagreements or issues that you might have on the East Coast, you could always move west. And so, his viewpoint was that if America is now fenced in, if manifest destiny has been achieved, and we are all within our borders, are we condemned to follow the patterns of class division and social conflict like Europe? It's interesting that he makes this observation. One of the major impacts, though, is that he imagines that the United States is sort of bottled up when the real migration was to cities. So the density of people going to places isn't really in the farming areas, right? Well, it's going to be in the cities. We The other implications here is that there is a constant desire for expansion. So going back, we can trace this all the way back to the founding of the colonies, when the belief was that these English colonists had the right to take whatever land they wanted to. That gets, as we press fast forward, that just accelerates, and this gets us to the connection with U.S. imperialism. So we're going to take a lot of these ideas from Manifest Destiny and map them onto, well, let's go out to the Philippines, and let's go out to these other territories that are, to us, seem available. We'll discuss this more when we get to period 7, but it's important that this groundwork is laid here. So as I said in the beginning of the video, the biggest impact here is on the Native Americans in the West. So remember that as a result of the removal policies, is that Native Americans were being pushed out west, and then they were placed onto reservations. So in this period is where we get the concept of a reservation. That territory was then set aside. Of course, some of this land was taken for white settlers during the Homesteads Act, and they were not Native Americans were given some of the worst territory in the United States. So the ghost dance was a ceremonial dance, ceremonial song and dance by Native Americans in order to I thought of it like a revival to resist white settlers. So they were trying to resist this sort of historical trend that we've seen, that Native Americans are constantly losing, unfortunately, to white settlers, and this was their resistance against this. So there's some videos on YouTube about what a ghost dance looks like, but it was just a ceremonial dance that was meant to inspire the tribes. So as a result of this migration west, we have the Indian Wars, and some of these we shouldn't consider them battles. We should consider them more massacres, where the U.S. soldiers are coming in and committing violence against not only men but women and children. Notably, the Sand Creek Massacre. Little Bighorn is where the Native Americans defeat a U.S. U.S. Army. But then at the Battle of the Massacre of Wounded Knee, this is where the United States, this is the end of the Native Americans wars, where they kill approximately 200 Native Americans there. So we see violence was one answer to the Native American question. And then another answer was assimilationists. So we've seen the pattern of assimilationists before, where there was this concept that we should fold Native Americans into society, not by embracing their differences, but by trying to make them, to assimilate means to turn them into the dominant group. So in A Century of Dishonor, this woman advocated for formal education, job training, and conversion to Christianity. We also see that something called the Carlisle School was created to teach white culture, where Native American children are being taught um, Christianity and really taught to defy their sort of ancestral culture. And a major term here is the Dawes Severalty Act. So this was designed to break up tribal organizations, again giving 160 acres per family, but you had to break away from your tribe in order to do this. So the idea was to break up these connections that they had, and that Native Americans would be granted U.S. citizenship after 25 years, which seems extremely long to me. And 47 million acres would be given to Native Americans. And this, again, was not the best land to create a farm on. But 90 million of, under the Dawes Severalty Act, 90 million of it went to whites. So another mention here is that as Americans are pushing west, they're starting to realize that these natural resources, these things that we're destroying through the mining industry, and that we should attempt to protect them. So there was the creation of Yellowstone and Yosemite, and what we do see is this rise of the conservationists versus the preservationists. So the conservationists want to utilize the natural resources in a responsible way, whereas preservationists want to leave it alone, right? So this is a picture of Yosemite, and we've got I got a picture of Red Dead Redemption 2 because it looks good. So another figure to know is John Muir in the Sierra Club. Preserving natural areas from human interference, right? That's what he wants, what his goal was. The New South. So this was one of those topics that were tacked on, and I want to make sure that this gets covered because this is what's happened post Reconstruction to the South. So there was a fellow named Henry Grady who tried to recharacterize the South in terms of this new economic progress. And it's one of these things where some progress was made. However, most of the South lived in poverty. What was the progress made? Well, there was the rise of a steel industry in Birmingham, Alabama, the lumber industry in Tennessee, tobacco, and textiles in Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina started to outpace the production of textiles, of cloth in New England. So there was some economic development. However, there was mainly continued poverty. So, the other thing I forgot to mention here, the expansion of the rail. So what they did was they were able to connect the southern rail system to the northern rail system, which allowed them to have this sort of national economy. So the continued poverty. So it was stated in the chapter that on average, a southern factory worker in the South earned about as half as much as the people in the North, right? And this is sort of interesting to think about. Why is that? Well, there wasn't the chapter claims that the South had a really late start in industrialization, so they didn't have the labor available, and they didn't have the right skilled kind of labor available. These people didn't have the right education and limited skills, but there wasn't the development of it as strongly as it was in the North. There were more incentives in the North versus the South. In terms, when I say incentives, I mean government incentives to begin these businesses. So within the realm of agriculture, this agriculture was still the dominant industry in the South. And between 1870 and 1900, the number of acres that were dedicated for cotton doubled. So what's interesting to me is the story of cotton, which exploded pre-Civil War, is now exploding even further. The problem with that is that it's now the entirety of this band of the South is now entirely dependent upon one crop. So as we see production worldwide for cotton develop in other countries, it drops the price of cotton, and therefore it hits all these local farmers incredibly hard. So George Washington Carver was a African American scientist who helped develop new ideas around crop rotation, and he wanted to diversify the southern crops, so leading to development of peanuts, soybeans, and sweet potatoes. In the face of these issues that they were facing, again, extreme poverty for both Black and white sharecroppers and tenant farmers, there was what we call the Southern Farmers Alliances. We're going to see something similar to this in the West. However, the difference here is that these farmers are banding together to form a political alliance to resist some of these dramatic changes to their lifestyle, but they're segregated. That the black farmers associations, the white farmers associations don't want the black farmers in their association, which it would actually work to their benefit if they did work together. So the big story here is about segregation and the rise of Jim Crow. So with the Compromise of 1877, the Democrats retained local power, state and local power, and they were called these Democrats the Redeemer governments. And these Redeemer governments or Redeemer Democrats, they were looking to redeem the South, right? So there was this positive spin on it to make the South great again, but by and large, this meant turning back the clock on African Americans and their rights. So, how did this happen, right? So we have some key civil rights cases, and what was determined was that Congress couldn't regulate intrastate and private commerce, including issues with discrimination. So does a railroad and does a union, does a company have the right to discriminate against somebody because of their skin color? Well, in this time period, they said yes. So landmark case, Plessy versus Ferguson, where a fellow named Plessy got on to society saw him as an African American man. He claimed to be 1/8 African American, and he got onto the train. And so this was actually one of these cases where they deliberately chose somebody who kind of walked the line in terms of this racial, how we conceive of race in the United States. In any case, they chose Plessy to violate this law or violate this company policy, and he was arrested and then claimed that under the 14th Amendment, he should have the right equal protection under the law. However, the Supreme Court says that we can't. We'll actually look at this Supreme Court case in detail, so I won't spoil it there. But ultimately, this leads to the rise of the Jim Crow laws, which legalize segregation. We have so along with the discrimination within the Supreme Court, we see the loss of civil rights. And why is it that African Americans were so successful in post or during Reconstruction? They were sending senators and sending representatives to the National Congress, and then it drops off. Well, with the advent of what are called literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses. So a literacy test is literally like they would give you a test to see if you're qualified to vote. Poll taxes is they would charge you to vote. And grandfather clauses would say that if your grandfather could vote, then you are able to vote. And all of these things have nothing to do on its surface about race, but of course it impacts African Americans who haven't had access to education, who are disproportionately impoverished due to sharecropping, and when their grandfathers were enslaved. So this led to, in Louisiana, in 1896, 130,000 Black voters were registered, and then it doesn't dwindle, it drops to 1,300 in 1904. It's a 99% drop, right? So when we see something like in 2021, when the Georgia, sends its first Black senator, Georgia sends its first Black senator in 2021. It's sort of amazing to look how the trends of history have played out and how we're still here, we're still in it. Another major factor here is that we see this vigilante justice, in quotes, where Black men are being accused of crimes that the court would either not get a chance to litigate or not get a chance to arrest and go through the legal process, and white men would gather up and lynch lynch these men. So we had 1,400 men killed in the 1890s as a result of this, as a result of, we call it domestic terrorism. So in this response to segregation, so there one concept or one idea was this the migration society. This echoes something called the American Colonization Society, that there was an American Colonization Society is white men looking to assist Africans from going back to Africa. But now there was some African Americans themselves who are saying, let's go back to Africa because the situation here in the United States is untenable. We do have some what are called exodusters when African Americans moved to Kansas and Oklahoma. This is sort of the precursor to the Great Migration that's going to come later. That's going to have a major impact on American society. We have Ida B. Wells, who was actively protesting and actively writing out against lynching, and which was incredibly brave because she was the one who's also receiving death threats, and so she had to move her operations up north while she was based in Memphis, but again advocating for the end of these things, as well as the end of she protested against the Plessy versus Ferguson, the segregation cases. So another major debate here is Booker T. Washington versus W.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington was a former slave, and when he saw the conditions in the South, his solution was that African Americans should be working hard to prove themselves to white society. And in that way, they will earn the respect only through hard work and making money and doing well, right? There's a quote about him about saying that the a dollar is like a green voucher, like a dollar's worth way more than a vote at the ballot box, because a dollar gives you some sort of social power. So he was advocating for more of industrial education and ensuring that African Americans could establish themselves economically, again with the premise that whites will like this and then accept African Americans as equals. So W.B. Du Bois was a civil rights leader who said, no way, right? That if we're not going to wait for whites to give us our rights, we ought to be fighting for civil rights, the right to vote. We should be demanding this immediately. Helped establish the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He had some really compelling ideas about the state of African American life during this time period that I think resonate to today. He published a book called The Souls of Black Folk, where he makes an argument that African Americans are two things, right? They are American and they are African, and there is this sort of what he called a double consciousness in African Americans to being both things, and so attempting to reconcile that. So W.B. Du Bois spoke out against Booker T. Washington, and Booker T. Washington, by no surprise, was more accepted in white society, and he was congratulated by Andrew Carnegie and Teddy Roosevelt. So when we think of this is major, right? So this is post-Reconstruction. What happens to the South? Essentially, things get worse, right? Things get worse. And then it makes you wonder why we have to revisit these ideas going to the 1950s and 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, right? So this is where this is all going. So as stated before, is that it was not easy for people in the Southwest and North to have a sustainable farm. One of the major impacts here was industrialization. Right? Industrialization enters into the fields. So in order to be successful and do the economies of scale, meaning like you're going to produce on the scale that you wish to need to be successful, you need there's a very high cost to that with the machines. And of course, as the production goes up, so I want you to look at this graph from 1866, end of the Civil War, to right here, 1890, 1895 or so, is that prices plummet to that's 20 cents, right? So what's happening here is that as production increases, as something is more available, the price of something goes down, right? If you go to take an economics class, this will be like one of the things you talk about on the first day, supply and demand. As supply goes up, the demand, therefore the price goes down. And again, these small scale farmers are going to be pushed out by buying and selling equipment or associated with selling the products, meaning what are some limitations there? Well, it's the railroad companies that own the rights or they own the transportation. So that if you wanted to sell your crops to a distant market where you could make money, you have to go through the railroad and they'd be charging you discriminatory prices. So there's that. There's buying equipment. There's the reapers that they would use. The large scale machinery that would make farming sustainable. And on top of that, there were taxes paid. So you had to pay taxes on the land that you lived. But if you were an investor, you did not have to pay taxes on the money you made through stocks, right? So we're still wrestling with that today about the capital gains. If you're curious about this, is the capital gains taxes. So what did farmers do in response? We had something called the National Grange Movement, which attempted to form a business association with all of these farmers so that they could leverage more of their power together. Think of it like a big farmers union. And then they advocated for what are called Granger laws, which would have targeted railroads. So what happened here? What did they want? They wanted the states to be able to regulate the prices of the railroad transportation. And while they were successful temporarily, and they won a case called Munn versus Illinois, where the states could regulate the prices that railroads were charging because it was a public service. Through the Wabash case, overturned it because these railroads were going interstate, meaning that the federal government really had the right to regulate interstate commerce. So established this interstate commerce commission, the Interstate Commerce Clause, which again attempted to regulate the railroads, but in the face of corruption and in the face of these powerful lobbyists, it was not successful overall. So we also see more what are called the growth of the farmers' alliances. We reference this in the South with the segregated farmers' alliances, and they came together in Florida and developed something called the Ocala platform, which they advocated for the direct election of senators. Up until this point, or up until now, this point in history that we're discussing, the individual citizens did not vote for senators, right? It was they were elected through the state governments. So for what they wanted was a more responsive government. So they wanted to be the ability to vote out senators that did not do what they wanted them to do, right? So this is something that's going to come in what we call the progressive movement. They wanted lower tariff rates so they could sell their products easier abroad. They wanted what's called a graduated income tax. So what a graduated income tax is that the less money you make, the less percentage of a tax you pay. So for example, if you make $50,000 a year, you'll be taxed at 25%. Whereas if you make $100,000 a year, you'll be taxed at, let's say, 30%. So you're being taxed a higher percentage the more you make. And again, this is sort of against the moneyed interest, the moneyed class going against them. And they wanted a federal banking system to help regulate the money because they were short on cash. They were always short on cash. And so all of this stuff will come into play later on when we talk about the Omaha platform and the populist movement, which will come in a later chapter. So for the short answer review, this is basically the farmers of the United States are up in arms. They were the bone and sinew of the nation. They're the largest share of its wealth. They're getting, they say, the smallest share for themselves. The American farmer is steadily losing ground. His burdens are heavier every year, and the gains are more meager. He's beginning to fear that it may be sinking to servile condition. He has waited long for the redress of grievances. He purposes to wait no longer. So briefly explain in an event in the Gilded Age that supports the farmers were up in arms. So where did we see resistance against it? Well, there was the Grange The Grange movement, we saw the Ocala platform, where farmers are protesting and lobbying for changes, specifically with the railroad industry. Briefly explain what evidence would support the statement about farmers that his burdens were heavier every year and his gains were more meager. So the falling prices, because of the increased production, the falling prices meant that farmers were losing money. Something I failed to mention earlier on is that farmers had to take loans out, and so now they were making less money on the crops that they were producing, but they took out loans. So you had to pay back loans with a smaller income. So the other burdens that farmers had was that buying and investing in equipment. So his burdens are getting heavier and his gains are more meager. So he's having to pay, his costs are going up and his profits are going down. Explain what the writer most likely had in mind when he states he's beginning to fear that he may be sinking into servile condition. So when I think of servile, it connects me to slavery, but who is the farmer being a slave to? Well, namely the railroad companies and an unresponsive government. Is that their condition, which it's sort of ironic that farmers went out there and we developed this national character of the rugged individualist, the idea that you can go out and strike out on your own fortune and be successful, was largely dependent upon these larger forces like railroads, which could make or break you. Okay. So coming back to the essential questions, to what extent did the natural environment shape the development of the West beyond the Mississippi and those who lived and settled there? So, of course, the mining industry needs to be mentioned because of its because it drew so many immigrants. We also see the establishment of these 160-acre farms and the difficulties they face due to the environment. So the natural environment shaped the development of the beyond the Mississippi and those lives who settled there. How important were other factors? So the real factor here is the development of the West. So what was another factor? Well, we also have the railroad company as a economic force, which limited the um, which limited the development, or limited which I say not limited, controlled the development of the West. And I think this question of development of the West has, like when we say what caused it, or it's certainly the natural environment was there, but I mean, I would also have to mention something about how the Indian Wars and Native American decimation was also responsible. So, to what extent, I would say that while there were some factors that drew some settlers in due to the mining industry and the incentives of the government to farm, other factors such as railroad companies, which control the development of the West, and the resultant conflict with Native Americans, really was the major impact of this period. Analyze the ways in which technology, government policy, and economic conditions changed the American frontier. Technology, government policy. So, what government policy did we see? Well, we saw the Homestead Act and the Dawes Severalty Act, which granted land to people out west and even to Native Americans, changed the American frontier. Technology. So, it did make mention of the barbed wire and how that, as a piece of technology that was able to fence in the farms, but limited the cattle ranges. Technology analyzes wages, government policy, economic conditions. So I think that the biggest story here, though, is that as prices of crops and prices of crops increased, Let me do this little trick here. It put a downward pressure. Oh, sorry, as the availability of crops increased. Pressure on prices. So those are the major economic issues here. And I already mentioned the monopolies of the railroads here. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. I hope this was helpful and it wasn't too long. How did I do? Worse than last time. Okay, so this video will be incredibly important for understanding Chapter 17. I will see you guys later. Thank you very much.